to the Nonprofit Lab, a podcast dedicated to the ongoing discovery of how we can all be a bigger part of social change through the lens of the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Puya Porak. I'm an industrial engineer, enthusiast of Persian cuisine, and CEO of Match Nice, a social impact tech startup with a mission to connect the nonprofit ecosystem and maximize social impact. And right now, we're working to launch a new kind of impact-centric fundraising platform that empowers nonprofits and donors to tie online donations directly to social impact. Join us on our startup journey as we look to uncover and shake up the status quo in the world of nonprofits. On today's episode, I speak with Briana, aka Bree Franklin, about her journey with the Prosperity Project, a nonprofit with a mission to improve the financial and economic mobility of college-educated Black women. We chat about how Bree's nonprofit supports and financially empowers Black girls and women dealing with student loans, the importance of being clear on your mission and who you serve, attracting donors who align with your vision, donor transparency and ROI, the seasonality of fundraising, and an iterative approach to impact measurement, plus more. Bree Franklin is the co-founder, president, and CEO of the Prosperity Project. She's a businesswoman, philanthropist, and student loan debt expert, thought leader with a passion for socioeconomic and holistic empowerment of Black girls and women. Having taken on a financial burden of nearly $120,000 in student loan debt through her undergrad studies at Dartmouth College, Bree developed an acute appreciation for the challenges many student loan debt holders experience, and in recognizing the extent to which other Black women are impacted by the $1.8 trillion student debt crisis and lack of financial literacy, she formed the Prosperity Project as a solution for eradicating these systemic barriers. Her work has been profiled in outlets such as Forbes, BuzzFeed, Authority Magazine, and Thrive Global, attracted support from audiences worldwide, and achieved numerous milestones. It's my pleasure to share my conversation with Bree Franklin. Tune in. Hey, Bree, welcome to the Nonprofit Lab. How are you?
I'm so well. Thank you for bearing with our scheduling challenges. It's great to finally get a chance to tee this conversation off.
Yeah, well, thanks for making the time. It's always great to have another guest, another nonprofit leader on the show. So, one question I usually ask my guests is, how did you get into the nonprofit sector? So, can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
For sure. So it was not actually something I set out to do. It was more so like the circumstances were aligning in such a way that this was what made sense. So actually going into the period when we founded, which was in June of 2020, I had just moved from my hometown of Atlanta to the Bay Area about 5, 6 months prior at the top of 2020. Then, of course, COVID came in and just upended everything. So at the time, I was working in the fitness industry and was hoping to break into corporate and, just climb the ranks in that field. But then once everything was shuttered, I was just forced to kind of think like, okay, well, we're in a critical time right now. Of course, Black Lives Matter was starting to heat up like we'd never seen before. And then there was just like this sort of calling that I felt where I was like, I have learned too much and I feel like I have too much to offer to just like not be doing anything, and trying to bring my own solution to the table. So I initially had set out to join like an influencer on her team, and I was trying to go from the angle of DEI, and I ran a survey and I got like over 1,000 responses, and that data ended up actually changing my perspective. And I went from thinking, let me try to get in with her team to I need to create something in its own right that stands on its own two legs. And so that ended up being just like the early days of Prosperity. And then before I knew it, I was like putting a name to it. We were setting up a website. It just very quickly evolved past like this passion project into its own vehicle.
That's really interesting. I'm noticing this trend with some of my other guests, other nonprofit leaders, and many of the executive directors, many of the founders start with a problem and they take a
Mhm.
one step towards that. And then
Yep.
they realize, okay, well, I need to do something even more and organize a nonprofit around that. For you, it sounded like that first step was this DE&I survey. What was the data that got you to go, oh, and I want to do something more?
So, for context, the person whose team I was trying to get on, she was like a longtime idol of mine, mostly in the fitness, but more recently, she's pivoted to be more about business and brand building. And then I listen to her podcast, and she talks about, finance and making better money decisions. And so, I was trying to appeal to her, so I structured the survey to cover all those areas. So it was asking things, about like income level, degree level, asking about being able to manage money, being able to start a business, like if you've run into any barriers with that, and then just even holistic health and wellness, like have you run into challenges and experience like medical discrimination or things of that sort. So it was just very like a wide net casted, because she was so comprehensive with her approach. And then, of course, it's no secret that like Black women have the short end of basically every stick, no matter what category we're talking. And so just seeing those numbers, though, like up close and personally, out of my own LinkedIn network, which at the time was like 18,000 strangers, it was just like every time the cards just fall in that order. Like, the white folks, they were earning more, they had more in savings, they had more financial literacy. And then as you go, down the ranks of the like hierarchy, as it's sociologically, been established, it's like Black women were always struggling and coming up short. And so that's when I was like, okay, now that it's been made personal and I'm not just reading an article in the Times or USA Today, these are people who, even though they were anonymous, like I know that the data set came from friends, family, and coworkers and such. It was like that was the fire that was just like, okay, time to light this match.
Wow. I love how you distinguished like this is something we knew, but then it became personal for you when you took this step, and I can relate to that on the gender equality issue where
Mm,
it was just like something as a man I always knew, but
mhm.
until I started having real conversations with real people in college about it, it wasn't as real, like you know something, but until you can like hear the stories or see the data and know that it's affecting people in your community, then it becomes more prevalent. so
Completely.
so this then led you to the Prosperity Project. Tell us about the mission and your role and what you guys are up to.
For sure. So yeah, I mean, as we've evolved and gotten excellent leadership and advisoryship to help us really draw this out of us, our mission is that we are devoted to helping college educated Black women, with outside student loan debt, improve their socioeconomic trajectory. And so really, I mean, right now we're all in on our single initiative, the 35 to free initiative. And with time, we'd like to expand that to also cover health, wellness, and fitness and make it sort of a full circle thing and be able to have a more comprehensive approach. But, just as a small bootstrapping nonprofit, we have to just not bite more than we can chew. So, we very early in like, we started June 7th of 2020. And then I think by like Juneteenth, which was, the 19th, we had already come up with student debt as like our leading cause that we were going to rally around, because myself and our founding team, it's something that we have all been like severely disenfranchised by, and to various extents. But it was something that just right away we were like almost trauma bonding over it. And it was just like, oh my gosh, this is, it's just such a menace in our own lives. So I think without question, we have to make or take action in this regard. And then very quickly, as we continue to just test the waters and make the efforts to get that on people's radars, we got some feedback that was like, so you're just paying off debt, like, well, what about actually helping people learn how to manage money? And so that's when we were like, yes, the two need to go together, and it needs to be an integrated approach to where student debt is a means to financial freedom, but not a complete solution in and of itself. So then that's when we got the idea to incorporate the financial literacy piece of our program. And that, of course, has taken us so long because we wanted to get it right. And we didn't want to just outsource to any old solution, because as one of our advisors points out, there's thousands out there, but there's a reason why the rates are still so low. She's like, clearly they're still missing the mark in some way. So yeah, just from those early days on, we were very like clear in the vision and in what direction we want it to move in. And then it's just been a matter of learning and iterating and getting it right as we go.
I think that the way you describe that is just another emphasis point about how launching a nonprofit is very similar to launching just any business, because you have this target population, you have this mission that you're pursuing. And I like how you kind of said that, oh, well, there's a lot of things that we could have done, but we started with student debt.
Mhm.
And then you're focusing on remedying that issue, and then the complexity of that issue is starting to unfold itself, and then you're moving from just addressing kind of the what that issue is to going after the root cause, like, okay, financial literacy is part of that. So is the programming at the Prosperity Project right now just focused on helping Black women reduce student loan debt and increase financial literacy? And where do you see that expanding to?
That's definitely the bulk of it. Just like as we've gone through this, like the aim was to be able to, award like full student debt relief, 100% wipeout, and then, like a very rigorous financial coaching program, and then also like personalized mentorship. But, we started to get better input over the the journey, and people who came with experience and are like, I love the dream and I love the aspirations, but y'all are going to be trying to like accomplish this for the next 10 years. Like it's going to take so long to reach that. And they're like, you want to start small and you want to have like an MVP. And, yes, it does sting to have to like trade that off and say, no, even though you have like $150,000 and we'd love to be able to like help get rid of all of that for you, just from the sake of like sustaining operations, we just quite literally cannot. So yeah, I mean, those are definitely the core pieces. And it's like, as they go through the program, our Prosperettes, they have the 6-month FinCo. And then once they complete that, then they'll get a payment. And then once they finish the whole thing out, which in this round is only 8 months. So after that, there's just 2 months of CDev, career development. Then they would get the rest. And the CDev, very transparently, we had to just, kind of roll with the punches, and we couldn't be as robust in that component this time around because we just needed to get a move on and rolling it out, completing one model so that we can fundraise and move forward. But yeah, as of right now, it's like they'll do that more to a supplementary extent with workshops that are very general and they can really be of help to anyone. It's like how to write a really strong and pristine bio, how to rework a resume, cover letter, public speaking, combating imposter syndrome, just a lot of like personal development type things. So, I mean, as we grow, we'd love for that to look like one-on-one mentorship in the way that we first aspired, but it's definitely a slow process.
One step at a time.
Yeah.
It's an incredible mission, and we should have set this up front in the intro, but me and you met through One Rise, which
Yes.
is a sort of like a startup accelerator incubator program founded by the or funded by the World Economic Forum, designed for immigrants, first generation, second generation immigrants. And I'm just, I've certainly had my challenges with just fundraising for my startup and,
Mhm.
getting Match Nice fully capitalized in this pre-seed round. And I'm not attributing 100% of that at all to like, oh, I'm an immigrant and that's why. But I'm curious from your perspective as a Black woman yourself, what challenges have you seen or experienced on your startup journey that maybe you've gained perspective to and look back on and you're like, oh, well, maybe that was a little bit different, or, just any general challenges that you wanted to share?
Sure. I mean, there's of course been so many, like in every capacity, like just from the operations side to the programming side to interpersonal relationships on the team. I would say the most like staggering have been seeing how the world views this problem that we're so passionate about because I don't think I mentioned this earlier when describing it, but the reason that we settle on the student debt is because Or I did, yeah. Our founding team, we've all been affected by it. And in my specific case, I graduated with 100K in principal. And by the time I went into repayment just over 2 years later, it was up to 116 thanks to interest. And I mean, just you name it, like not able to get my own place, not able to afford living solo, and obviously completely out of the running for, other types of loans. And just because my DTI ratio was horrific, it's not just been a matter of like, oh man, I can't afford to like buy these cool shoes I saw on Amazon. It's like I am behind the eight ball as like an adult, like as my own person. And it's made me at times very resentful of going to get a degree, because I'm just like, it set me up for failure and financial ruin, like, to be completely honest, was how I saw it for the longest. And so there's just a lot of like emotions behind it. It wasn't just a black and white sort of thing. And so when we were appealing to donors, or prospective donors who we hope would have been more supportive, they were just like, these are older, rich white folks who by and large are just so far removed from this because affording college was never an issue. Or if they did have to, then, it was back in the day when you could just work your way at a library and then pay, a semester off, right? So there was like this huge disconnect. And it was like, a lot of just criticism of like, well, what happened to just getting a job and doing it the old school way? I mean, like, you just want people to give, these women handouts. I mean, what kind of message does that send? And I'm like, no one is saying that they don't have responsibilities. Like, it's more so the mindset of you can look at a problem two ways. You can say, okay, well, that's on you. Like, I paid my debt, or I didn't have to worry about that. So that's on you to figure out, quit whining, blah, blah, blah. Or you can say, you know what? I'm fortunate to be in a position where I'm not affected by this and I can help you. And by helping you, that will elevate you and allow you to help other people. So I think just being able to like say that, but in a very respectful way, because it definitely does like trigger something very personal for me, is a big lesson that I've had to learn.
I feel like many of the listeners have experienced some degree of that with like the generations before us. Like, I know certainly with like some family, like you're like, oh my gosh. I personally still, I have like student loan debt. It's not
Mhm.
$100,000, but it's not an insignificant amount of money.
Sure.
And it's the same thing. It's like, oh, well, when I was in school, I just like, paid it off. Like, what? It was like, yeah, that was when tuition was $300 a year.
Right. Give me a
Uh,
break.
and
Yeah.
it keeps going up. I mean, I'm seeing in the news that, it seems like the Biden administration is pushing for some kind of student loan forgiveness, and we'll see where that goes. But it must be there's probably even more obstacles or layers of potential prejudice when it's a group of black women asking like for this debt forgiveness, because then like whatever narratives people might have in their minds about welfare programs or what that looks like. I used to consult for government, where I kind of saw the differences in the angles around welfare programs between like conservative party lines versus more liberal party lines. And so, how have you managed to navigate the donor ecosystem, knowing your mission, knowing who you're serving, and knowing the perceptions of your donor base? Like, how have you strategically maneuvered that to find the funding that you need to make your mission successful?
For me personally, it was a matter of just, going through these exercises and these conversations and taking away from that, like, we're just not for everybody. It's like we can do the marketing right. We can work with the best in the business to try to get our point across and to make it as like, I don't know about neutral, but as palatable to understand and process for an outsider as we can. But ultimately, it's like if they just are committed to, seeing this as problematic, that we're racializing everything, or, just kind of worried about the wrong things. I mean, we've even had people come into when we did our first in-person fundraiser in December. Some of the feedback that we got was, well, we were coming into this and we were going to donate $5,000, but we've reduced it to 1,000 because we see that you have all these like fancy goodie bags to give people. And you had this very kind of nice posh setup, which, everything was donated. We didn't spend a dime, even for like beverages. It was our advisors chipped in, and they put their resources to work to make that, give us a first impression that was better than we could have pulled off without their help. And it's just kind of this damned if you do, damned if you don't, because especially for Black business owners, it's like we have the worst reputation, even in our own community. Like there's so many people who are just like, I try to give Black people a chance, but it just takes one bad encounter. And then, but meanwhile, they give McDonald's workers who mess up their ice cream cones like all the grace in the world, right? And it's just like, being able to just get your foot in the door and people give you a chance. It's just made me, come back to that realization we're not for everyone. So it's just made me gravitate more towards people who are already doing work in a similar way, whether that's student debt relief, racial equity, financial literacy, a combination of the three. And just being able to have faith in, okay, like some people do get it, and it's way more worth our time to connect and invest in relationships with that crowd. And not to say that we've just completely discounted and given up on, appealing to others, but we're like, it's a prioritization game, right? So just realizing that we can have like our e-newsletter team put together periodicals and fun stats charts to help open their eyes to the issue, but spend most of our energy and put our eggs in the basket of just aligning with like minds and moving from there.
I've had the exact same experience in terms of like reviewing our startup budget and connecting with some investors. Like it's like, oh well, you're just not in the like the wheelhouse of what we're interested in. You're not like, okay, so sector misaligned, right? Or like in your case, it would be like cause misaligned.
Mhm.
Um, and then like looking at the budget, it's like, we've cleaned it up quite a bit, but it's like, do you really need this much money for X? Like, there's kind of like this level of scrutiny. But what we've learned on our research, talking to donors, there's kind of the shift, right? Like it used to be, and I think it's starting to fade out a little bit more, where like you would donate to, I don't know, say some kind of like ocean conservancy or whatever, and then that organization would send you like a thank you card with a stuffed animal, like a stuffed whale or something. And people and
Mhm.
donors are starting to say to themselves, like, I don't want this stuffed animal. Like, I want the money that went to this to go towards this cause.
Right,
And,
right.
I think that's a big part of the premise of what we're trying to do with Match Nice is to help create transparency between where donors' money goes and the impact that it's making. So curious how when you do have people challenging, hey, like, is my money going towards these goodie bags? Like, what's happening to my money? What's the impact of my donation? Describe the thought process and like any examples of challenges you've had where maybe donors have asked that, or opportunities you see for the Prosperity Project to create that kind of connection so donors do feel comfortable or more clear about the impact of their donations.
Yeah, that's a big one. Just because it takes knowing the nonprofit climate to really get that right. Because before Prosperity, I had made my own attempts into business in the for-profit world. I had a very small startup called the English Major Takes Tech, which was just, kind of like a consultancy, writing house sort of thing. And so it really is just like learning an entire new way of thinking and going about things, and also just what to reasonably expect from people. Because one of our advisors who's come in, I mean, she's been like out of this world helpful because she herself has extensive nonprofit expertise, and she's got some years on us, so just naturally more experienced in that way. And she was like, the reason why you're getting this criticism is because donors are, it's like their money, and it's not like they're getting something directly in exchange. And especially our fundraiser attendee crowd, I mean, probably 9/10 of the room, maybe even 10/10, were all investors with very extensive portfolios. And so she was like, they're looking at this as an investment. And so even though it's not going to work in the same way, they still expect like a very high ROI on what they are putting into your organization. And so, I mean, for me, it's been a great motivator for getting my own financial thinking and affairs in order, because I used to be the worst with money. I used to ignore my bank account. I used to pray my card wouldn't decline when I go to the grocery store. I would like keep up a budget for maybe 2 weeks and then just let it flail into the abyss with my other Google Docs. And it was just like I took no responsibility because it really like terrified me. But so this has forced me to get over that for the sake of keeping our books up to date and making sure that everything is accounted for. And then also thinking very resourcefully, how to make a dollar stretch when we get like invited to go to things and events. And it's like, oh man, like that would be so much fun. But, for the amount of money that's costing and the time away from, being able to interface and handle business, ultimately we had to turn that one down. So, I mean, I already came into this work as a newly minted minimalist and just someone who was like hyper sustainability focused. So, this really just helped me take that to the next level and then contextualize it within the business realm. And so, yeah, I mean, just when I look at how to budget for the program, it's like our same advisor, she helped us, I say, turn our previous budget into what is it, like a donor magnet, because before it was donor repellent. It's like we had all these kind of fluff line items like, oh, we'll have these nice packages and these boxes that will send them goodie bags in, and we'll have like a graduation and we'll have photographer and catering. And she's like, we need to keep that virtual. Like they're all remote. The programs run online. We're not going to spend flight money on flying, 12, 15 women around the country for this. We got to be really strategic. So yeah, I think it was like a lesson in maturity for sure.
Well, I appreciate your vulnerability around just relationship with finances. I had this discussion with my wife recently about the differences in how we grew up with money. And I think like that is so important in the mission of what you're doing as well. Is,
Mhm.
like my wife grew up in a largely save up your own money and like in a moderation is good. Whereas I grew up in a very like money is scary. The bill collectors are
Mhm.
calling and scarcity mindset
Scarcity versus
around it.
abundant
And
mindset. Yep.
yeah, and that carried with me throughout. I was the same way. Like, don't like looking at the bank account was really scary.
Mhm.
Thankfully, my wife was really helpful in kind of helping me sit down and be like, you're an engineer, you can do this.
Yeah.
Um, but I think the big insight on that is one, hopefully, some more empathy for like why people come up into like a lack of financial literacy. It has a huge bit to do with how you grow up. And damn well sure our schools aren't teaching us how to manage finances or like
No, they're
pay
so
bills and
behind.
credit cards. And so people end up in these financial traps. And I love that you yourself have gone through that experience and want to help amp that up. And I also love the transparency you're creating in terms of just budgeting as a new nonprofit and like how critically to look at every line item expenditure and asking the question like, is it really supporting the impact that we're looking to
Yeah.
create? So, and also I like that you said like, there's really not like, maybe there is, I haven't seen like a specific playbook specifically around fundraising for like how to tie programming back to like fundraising and
Mhm.
impact. Like the most that we've seen it really is like kind of at this overall level. Let's just say like you're a nature conservancy. You do a lot of things as a nature conservancy, but what you present to donors is like, oh, every $10 helps us plant 5 trees.
Yeah.
And like all of the payroll, all of the overhead expenses, all of the supplies, like everything that it takes to run a nonprofit is like baked into this one activity number. Where we're trying to create a difference is tying that back to like specific programs and initiatives and progress that nonprofits are making. And I think like what you're pointing to and one of the insights for us is like how do we then make like coach help create the tools to coach nonprofits to more easily make that connection, because like you said, it's a whole different way of thinking, right? One last point on this, that from one of the first podcast episodes with Laura Otten, is impact measurement in the nonprofit space seems to be largely around just activity counting right now. So like for the Prosperity Project, it might be like, we've helped eliminate X many dollars. like student loan debt for our beneficiaries. But then like what are the other outcomes or impact like beyond that, right? Like and there's so many like tangible intangible things that's really hard to measure, but I'm curious to hear from you. Like, what are some of the ways that you all are measuring success for your nonprofit above and beyond just we have X much amount of debt and we were able to clear this much debt, which is like a very strong indicator of the performance of your mission. But there's like so much other possible impact and progress and support that you're creating for your beneficiaries. So I just wanted to hear kind of your thought process around that.
Yeah, I was actually just having a conversation on this the night before last, I think. And I mean, being at the forefront, we are in the data gathering stage. And so it's like right now it is all, what is it? Not tentative, but it's hypothetical. It's like we're going into this, with the belief that coming out of our program, our Prosperettes will have healthier relationships with money. I mean, just exactly that thing you talked about with the abundance versus scarcity way of thinking, just being able to do the deeper work and not just saying, okay, well, your bank account is growing, like that's cool and that's all you need to get out of this. It's being able to take that and internalize it, and hopefully making them better at whatever it is they're doing professionally, and realizing that the two, it's like all interconnected. And it's like if you have healthier habits with your money, you're more likely to be responsible in other regards. And whether that looks like managing and running a business, or even in parenthood, or whatever that looks like, just being able to take like that extreme ownership. Of course, we're hoping that things like credit scores increases will come out of that. Just being able to make noticeable difference in their DTI ratio, because we're also saying that while we are coming in with this, gift of up to $10,000, we are through this training trying to help them see like what all can I be doing to help light the candle from the other end, and not just say, okay, well, like whatever prosperity gives me, like that's all the progress I'm going to make on my debt. Like if there's of course legitimate reasons as to why, then it's, we'll hope that after they move forward from this, that they can continue to make more progress. But I mean, yeah, that's definitely only one of them. Yeah, I would just say having a healthier approach all around. And so the KPIs are still, I guess, being written, because we're about 2 weeks in as of right now, and so far so good. But we'll plan to do like a midway through assessment sometime in like August or so, and then just figure out from them, what's improving, what is working, what are some things that maybe we can retool next time around. And then by the time they make it to the career development stage in the fall, we'll hope to see that it complements and begets, an improvement in their professional lives, because so many of them have been at the mercy of the student debt. And it's like they just have, it's made them very resentful, like righteously so. Like it's made me resentful. So I'm not saying that in a punitive way, but just being able to like free them of that mindset, and then encourage them to take more risks when it comes to pursuing a promotion or quitting the job and starting the business. Like there's a few who are at various points along that spectrum, and we're hoping that this can, just draw that out of them and get them to that next point.
It sounds like it's a work in progress for almost every nonprofit. In that first episode, I keep harkening back to what I learned is impact measurement used to not be a thing at all for nonprofits when it first started. Then donors wanted it and donors funded it for nonprofits. And then it wasn't important anymore. So the roller coaster's coming down. And then
Hmm.
it became important for donors again, but this time donors aren't funding it. And it takes a lot of energy and effort and time and resources to have an effective impact measurement program. Are you seeing any kind of like what are some of the biggest constraints that you feel you have as a new startup where you like there's just a lot of demands that maybe you're having from donors, but then like the resources just aren't matching like the work in front of you?
Hmm. Wait, so to understand, you're asking like where the expectation is misaligned from what we can actually work with?
Yeah, that's about it. And
Yeah.
more specifically around like resources, like the expectation of I want you to like we want to see this delivered, but you're like, well, we don't have the funds or the resources to do that. So
Yeah.
just curious to understand like this dynamic that might happen between donors and nonprofits, but in like expectations of delivery and the reality of like the operations?
I'm trying to really think on that because I feel like the sorry to inform you news has mostly gone to our prosperettes because, again, like we promised the moon and the stars because at that time we genuinely believed that that was like a possibility. Like if we just kept working hard, the money's out there. Like Mackenzie Scott, Melinda Gates, everyone and their mother is, promising all this money for these very things, and then we just realized the hard way, like it's just not that easy. So I mean, with donors, I think they really are the ones who have come on board and cut the checks. They are just like, we're taking a leap of faith and we are hoping that you all will make good on this, and that, these sob stories that we sat through at the fundraiser, like that this is actually going to help them make measurable improvements towards getting away from those situations. I honestly can't say that we've been tasked with doing something that's just like completely beyond our scope, because I think student debt is just such a prevalent cause and it's like hogging so much mainstream attention, and it's got all these people who are like bought in, even if they themselves haven't been hit by it, people who are supportive and allies to that, and they're like, no, I hope for everyone's sake that this is cleared out and that this can just go away. I guess maybe just in terms of staffing, because it's like we are definitely a leaner team. And at one point we had like 45 plus volunteers. And that was when we were still like in the height of COVID and the pre-vaccine era, and people had way more time to devote and we're not as needing to focus on just paid opportunities because they were just like, who knows how long this is going to last. So yeah, I guess just being able to grow, because people keep asking us like, well, are you going to be able to offer more money, or is this the biggest size that you all can accommodate in a year? And it's like, we have no idea. Like we're trying to figure it out. And I honestly feel like the circumstances aligned to where we couldn't have moved forward if we were as oversaturated and over our heads as we were when we were trying to serve 22 women who had 1.7 million, and we had just like tied ourselves to that. But as we just became more practical mindset oriented, and we're like, okay, this is like we have to just make some strategic cutbacks, and then several opted out, and it just so happened to work out really well because we're like, well, that's less money we are responsible for fundraising, and now there's more we can invest per person. So yeah, I guess that mostly just has to deal with expansion of both the cohort and then as a result, the team that we have on board.
Yeah, thanks for painting a picture of the potential tension, not just between donors and the nonprofit and the expectations that live there, but the beneficiaries as well. Like that's a really interesting angle that I don't think I've thought too much about before. So thanks for kind of opening that door of curiosity for me in terms of like where what else is there. Um,
Yeah, so much behind the closed door.
yeah. As a new startup, how are you thinking about creating sustainable fundraising and these revenue streams that you can count on? What we've seen from researching and talking to different nonprofits is it's all over the board. Like some nonprofits, it's like, oh, 90% of all their revenue is coming from like grants, like big
Yeah.
government grants. Others, it's like, oh, well, we have this family and they like bankroll our nonprofit every year. So it's kind of like, it seems to be like that's like the two big kinds of status quo models for nonprofits is like, oh, we have like either a group of big check writers or we have these grants that we're applying for. And the way that we see those two models is that it's a very donor centric way of raising capital for your nonprofit. Because in the grants, what do grants have? It's like a huge list of requirements for qualifying for and like exactly how, largely like directionally, how that money should be used.
Mhm.
And for big donors, they're writing these checks, but with that big check comes some level of influence on the programming and the operations and like what that nonprofit is doing. And like what we want to do and what we want to create is like a more democratized channel for fundraising where it's broader than that and you're more diversified. So just curious about like how you all are starting and like your strategy and your thought process into diversifying your fundraising and creating something sustainable even if it isn't diversified.
I swear it's like you've been listening in on our meetings because we have talked about this so much in recent weeks in particular. I mean, it's definitely risen to the forefront because we realize that there are seasons for success in the nonprofit world. And so, like, after the longest drought from when we incorporated until about last, like, November, it was just like we were so dry on funding. I mean, we got like our biggest grant at the time from Goldman through the 1 Million Black Women Initiative for 25K. That was granted in the spring, but didn't hit until sometime about June. And then from there, it was just like this complete desert. And we had been, turning so many different stones over, trying to figure out solutions. We thought about e-commerce and merchandising. And I mean, it was like the early talks of it were going well, but as we discovered, executing is another story. And so, yeah, the holiday season, like basically the week of Thanksgiving onward, it was like we're riding the money train. It was like 3 grants in one day that we were notified about. And then we had, tons of success with that in-person fundraising event. And then we, have continued to keep a little bit of momentum going coming into this year, but it's starting to dip a little bit again. So we actually talked about this with our mentor through One Rise, Rosario Casas, I think is her last name. And she is like just a wonder just in terms of her own presence and as an entrepreneur, and she has a very successful public speaking arm to what she does. And so that's something that I've started dipping my toes into, just with like different high school sessions. This organization called Next Gen Personal Finance, they do these like they're all about getting financial literacy into the classrooms as early as is age appropriate. So they asked me to speak to the high schools in their network, and every time we do a speech, it's 30 minutes of time, but we get like $1,000 in return per session. And so just being able to like see the difference and like having a little bit more control, because I'm like, if I can just book up and just put these on the calendar, like that's guaranteed revenue, which is a great feeling. So it's basically trying to rinse and repeat and make that a more robust offering. So we've now taken that corporate, and we actually have our first corporate event coming up next Wednesday with TD Bank, and then another in the pipeline for JP Morgan, which will likely fall sometime around Juneteenth. And then we know we've been approached by other companies that are not even necessarily in finance that want to hire us for this. So I mean, that's just been the most rewarding feeling to know that, like, oh my gosh, yes, like some of this is directly in our control. And it's not just submitting a grant application and saying prayers and hoping for the best. But then even aside from that, just taking it to the next level with relationship building. Like I'm here in Atlanta as a soft relocation for now, but will likely be moving back full time in the fall. And I've just been like hustling and networking my tail off. Actually, later tonight, I have an event that I've signed up for to go to, and then one tomorrow. And I have like 200 printouts advertising our upcoming virtual conference. And I've just been working every room and trying to get those on people's radars. And just even from those interactions, we're finding donations coming in, we're getting ticket sales, we're seeing that support just out of the gate. So, just trying to put, we have like five main pillars of fundraising, and just as I talked about before, prioritizing and trying to consider like, what's going to pan out, what has the strongest likelihood of panning out, what's worth our time the most, and then, how do we just control the controllables and do our part to turn that into actual checks.
That's super cool. I think the aspect of you providing a service that is valuable for the community to actually pay, and the revenue that you're generating from those services supporting your operations is this other huge like nod and kind of mark on the board for nonprofits being more business like than maybe people realize. Like,
Mhm.
I was just talking to an executive director from a youth outreach program. She was saying that like a lot of their revenue comes from the tickets they sell for people to come and actually visit their farms and like pet these
Mhm.
goats or whatever. So I think traditionally, like coming into the nonprofit sector, in my head, it's like, okay, nonprofits only survive on donations, but it's so much more than that. It's also like the services that you're providing being a big pillar of your revenue sources. And I love how you put it. It's like this is something we can control,
Mhm.
whereas counting on people writing you that big check, maybe not so much. And
Right.
also, just to give a nod to the seasonality of giving in the nonprofit sector, it's pretty wild. I just pulled up this stat that says 30% of all nonprofit giving happens during the last month of the year, from Giving Tuesday through the end of December, which, like, being ready to take advantage of those giving season spikes is also, I'm sure, a big part of the strategy.
Definitely. Like, I mean, we thought it was fodder, and I was like, I hope people aren't toying with us. But in our first year, we saw that as like plain as you possibly could have. It was like from Thanksgiving onward, just like a steady stream of people who we had been courting for the months prior, like on LinkedIn and in our networks. We're finally deciding, okay, now's the time I'm going to write the check. And then just getting, selected for various not giveaways, but different pages on Instagram. We're like, okay, to, the 5 nonprofits who submit a bid, we'll give you like $500 or $1,000. And then just some of those like very small but still exciting wins. And then, of course, last year, 2021, we saw the same thing happen. And so, it helps for setting the tone, because, like, I swear last summer, I thought we were done. I was like, we went from all of this support and all of these people fawning over this and, giving money and winning grants and all this. And then it's just been like completely quiet. And we had almost like an apocalyptic occurrence on the team, where it was just like, like probably 75% of our team suddenly was out, and again, that was mostly because of COVID times changing, and people were like, I finally found paid work and this is great, but I have my own student loans to take care of. So it just was really terrifying, but it was reassuring once I was able to bounce that off of experienced advisors and just other mentors and people who were like, don't fret, like you don't have to pack up just yet. This happens. The summer tends to be a quieter time. So why don't you lean into that quietude and just, like take the time to do things you usually don't have the time for, and
Mm.
organize and clean up, in-house, and get the G drive back in order. Like just use that, because it's not going to last forever, which, you want, but it is the case. So it was definitely helpful to just like experience it, because I think even reading about it, it's still there, like you can't really shake that fear of just like, are you sure that this is just seasonal and that we're not just completely fizzling out? It's a really hard distinction to identify.
Wow, yeah. There's so much to unpack there from for like our business and how we're thinking about how to best serve and support nonprofits. And I could see how challenging it might be to even get on the schedule or calendar, or ask for 30 minutes of time in November, or like even October, when nonprofits are really ramping up around events and other fundraising campaigns. But to hear you say kind of like summer periods or other parts of the year, like earlier in the year, like the mass emphasis on fundraising and like the money coming in maybe not as high. And so lots to think about there. Well, I'm looking at the clock here, and I want to be mindful of your time. I just had a couple of other questions for you. Coming back to the Prosperity Project, supporting Black women, I wanted to hear from you. What actions do you think the nonprofit sector could do, or should think about doing, to better support Black women and Black leaders
Mhm.
in the nonprofit sector? Not just helping the Black community, but specifically nonprofit leaders that are working in the sector.
You're asking like just general support or like within the community? Because I was trying to follow the first part of the question, then I started having thoughts, so I want to make sure I answer appropriately.
Well, I was trying to keep it open ended, so feel free to respond however you see fit. I mean, from your shoes, like what support do you think could be better?
I feel like there's so many ways. I mean, I think financial is like the obvious, where it's like, when people are asking, like, be that person that's like, yeah, I have $10. It's a worthy cause and you all are working really hard. So there's that. But I think just in terms of like as the leader, it's important to just have people believe in you. And so that's something that I would say it's been bittersweet, because I feel like since embarking on this journey, there have been times where I've just felt so alone and alienated, because it's like the choices that I'm making and the sacrifices I'm making, they don't always read well to family, who's concerned. And they're like, you still don't have like a steady job with benefits. Like, you got this cool thing or whatever, but like, when do you plan to actually start paying bills with this? And I'm, just being able to like stand my ground. And I'm like, I promise, I believe in this, and I know this is going somewhere, but I know it takes time. And I know that that's the trade-off. It's like you put in the sweat equity on the front end and you reap the rewards later, as long as you're, consistent and faithful and you're genuine in what you're doing, and not trying to work the system for personal gain. So yeah, I would say just the belief factor. Like, it's been such a blessing to be in One Rise and just be surrounded by people who have taken this journey in their own respects, and at the very basic level just can understand, and they're just not like questioning you as a person. Because even in very close relationships, like my partner, I call him the stability agent and I'm the growth agent, because he is a software engineer. So he's like very like a little overly logic minded. And so he even told me yesterday, he's like, I honestly, when you first said that you were starting a nonprofit, I was like, dear Lord, I hope that like, we will work out. Because he was like, I was resentful that, you weren't able to be like an equal contributor. And it just seemed like there were so many periods where things were going wrong. And I was like, well, why not just hang it up and just, migrate into the workforce? Like, you've got great skills. Like, there's no one who wouldn't hire you. And so just being able to like, even in the face of that, still continue to like stand by what you believe and just devote yourself unapologetically. So I would truncate that by just saying a really robust and genuine support system.
I relate so much to everything you just said about that as a founder myself. It can be lonely. You can have
Mhm.
really high highs and pretty low lows throughout, and those things can happen like in a day. So,
All in a day, in a matter of hours, honestly. Yeah.
yeah, and also, I think you have all of the right ingredients to be incredibly successful in this, because you're doing this because you fully believe in what you're doing, and you believe in something that's much greater than you, and you're not doing this for a financial return. But
Right.
that is, of course, a big part of like how to make this sustainable for yourself. So thank you
Mhm.
for sharing that, because I think it's another good insight and perspective into the sacrifices that nonprofit leaders oftentimes have to make a nonprofit work.
Definitely. Yeah, it's all a game of like risk tolerance, ability to sacrifice, ability to go without, be the odd one out. Yeah, just like knowing that what you're working towards, like if you truly believe that that's where your future is, just being able to follow it even when it's not convenient and when it's not fun and when it's not lucrative. Like,
Mm.
you got to be all in on this.
So, Bree, what do you want your lasting legacy to be?
I swear you've been like tapping my phone. Like I was telling, so I just went to a funeral last weekend for my uncle, and just that I think always, especially like as I get older, it really like motivates me to think like, what do I want, my imprint to be on the world? Because my uncle, I didn't even realize it until I read his obituary. Like he was an entrepreneur, and he had, put money and time into all these different business ventures, and he was very similarly minded. And so I'm just like, even looking at the form of like, cremation versus burial, not to make it dark, but my partner, he's like, yeah, how do you, like want your remains to be? And I was like, I honestly think planted into a tree and call it like a prosperity tree. I'm like, that's just so on brand for me. Like I'm Miss Save the Planet. I'm all about recycling, but also like this is my life's work. And I'm like, as long as I have a pulse, I will be committed, even if I'm, like of retirement age and someone younger and like better is able to come in and replace me as CEO. I'm like, I would love to keep this going as long as I'm able. And just being known as the one person who didn't balk at the $1.8 trillion behemoth of student loan debt, but then also not being afraid to shout from the mountaintops, like that Black women in particular, need to be, helped in this situation, and that we can't forget about them, and that it's time for us to rally together to support them.
Wow. Bree, Franklin, thank you so much for joining the Nonprofit Lab. Such a beautiful way to end it. I fully believe that you're going to bear the fruits of your labor before and after we all leave this earth. So thanks so much for joining. Thank you for everything that you're doing at the Prosperity Project, and excited to keep up with you and to support your cause.
Oh my gosh, the pleasure was all mine. Thank you for this platform and sharing the mic, and yeah, just for being able to help our cause reach more ears and eyes.
Thank you. Talk to you later.
All right.
Madeline and Ibrahim, welcome back to the Nonprofit Lab. Great to have you guys.
Hello, Huya.
Thanks for having us.
As always, back at the debrief where we're talking about the conversation, the interview. First off, I called Bree's nonprofit the Prosperity Project. I called it a startup multiple times throughout the interview, which to me is just like emphasizing the fact that nonprofits are actually very much like businesses. And there's so many other things that came up in that interview that pointed to that very similar experience of us being in a startup and what it's like for a nonprofit starting a nonprofit.
I had the same exact thought the entire time. I was like, wait, she's a startup founder, because she is, but also she's running a nonprofit. And I just was making so many of those same parallels of so many of the stories that she told we've experienced as a for-profit startup business.
Definitely. I noticed you calling it a startup a few times. And honestly, based off how new the Prosperity Project is, I think they said, June 2020 is when they incorporated. So they are technically in that startup realm. They're fairly new. So it made sense to call them that. And based off of the similar struggles they're facing with us in terms of, like the early startup journey, it's definitely relatable.
Yeah, a lot of things. For me during this interview, I had to face some of my own biases in terms of the cause that the Prosperity Project is working on, because I have student loan debt myself, and hearing Bree talk about the work that they're doing at the Prosperity Project had me pause and go, oh yeah, well, not everyone is equally affected by things, and there are like thinking about like nonprofits and businesses and this segmentation and getting really specific about what you're doing. Her cause of eliminating student loan debt and then getting down to the fact that disproportionately Black women are greatly affected by this, just was a huge just realization for me. Like, oh yeah, like of course, like, in America, the justice system isn't great, but it disproportionately affects Black people, or like immigration isn't the greatest, but it disproportionately affects like this group of people. And just to kind of come back to that realization of being specific and going after a very targeted cause and a targeted community, and how important that is for a nonprofit and how they define their mission, for me was kind of like a pause and a reflection moment.
No, it's honestly, it was interesting to see their perspective. I mean, a lot of the points that were talked about throughout the call, it kind of gave me better perspective because of someone who hasn't been too involved in like those specific areas, for example, right? Or someone who, I have friends who have mentioned these things to me in the past, but have never gone too in depth in terms of explaining to me the struggles, like what they're trying to tackle. I've gotten some high level points from them, but I've never seen, this interview that you had with her was probably the first time I've been able to sit down and for an hour straight, just to hear from someone in, that area of work, explain everything, what they're going through, and then give me a level of perspective in terms of, what can I do to potentially support, causes like that, as well as how can I be better suited to, I guess, educate people on those things. Because you guys went over a lot of misconceptions that people may have, or just a lot of misunderstandings, and that helped me get clarity. So now I know that I'm in a better position to educate people on that, or at least correct some of the misconceptions that people may have about it.
I think it also must have just been, Puya, you talked about this with your own experience with gender inequality, but it must have just been so powerful for Bree to have lived this experience of being at a disadvantage and feeling behind everyone else because of her student loans, and then putting this poll out and finding, and, knowing what the numbers are, blah, 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 right? That's one thing. But then when you put this poll out and you know that it's your own network that's answering you in the hundreds, almost thousands, and that the statistic is right there in front of you in your own world and your own experience. I mean, it's just bringing it to life, and it's kind of giving you the story behind those numbers. It's just got to be so powerful. I can see why that kind of sparked her into action.
Yeah, and that's been the theme of every guest on the show, right? It's like we're all aware of the larger issues that exist, the challenges that are there in the world, from hunger to, like you said, gender equality, to just poverty, and like we're all aware of these things, but it's not until it personally affects us that some people are inspired to take that action. And I'm continually inspired by these conversations, because it's a certain breed of person that does decide to do something, right? And it doesn't ever seem to start as, there's a problem, I'm going to start a 501c3, I'm going to apply for a tax exempt organization status, and I'm going to build an enterprise, a social enterprise. That, no, it's like, I just want to do something, and then it grows into something bigger.
Yeah. And I think it also really drives home how important storytelling is. And we hear this all the time, but this episode in particular just had me really hearing her story and empathizing. It's not something, I mean, I have student loans as well, but not in the same way that Bree and Black women have student loans. And just hearing that story, I think, yeah, it's so important to make that human connection, because we are just humans at the end of the day. And you can hear the numbers all day long, but even if it doesn't happen to you or you haven't lived it, like Evie were saying, just hearing the story is how you can become educated and teach others about what you know.
Definitely. And there's I guess one key thing that I noticed is, like, obviously, Puya, you had brought up like the idea of student loans. Madeline, you just did. There a lot of times, at least in my experience, for some reason, growing up, like even through like elementary, high school, college days, it wasn't frowned upon, but it just wasn't something you really talked about. Like I had classmates who I didn't know whether or not they were taking out student loans for their entire college degree, or if they were being supported by family, or some of them got full rides. Like everyone's situation is different, and it wasn't until I got close to graduating where a lot of my friends who I got closer to started being more open about their situations. And it was interesting to see, like, I know some people who the entire time I was going to school with them, they seemed comfortable, but then it turns out they were, 6 figures in debt. And like, Puya, I didn't know that you had student loans until you talked about it during that interview, because it just wasn't something that, is a typical conversation people have. But I feel like that transparency is becoming more normalized, and it should be, because being unknown of someone or being unaware of someone's current situation can kind of result in you saying something or doing something that may be interpreted incorrectly. And then also being aware of someone's, whether it's their financial situation, personal life, anything, that kind of gives perspective into, I can understand why things are going, like, or things are happening the way they're happening, or why things aren't happening the way that they're supposed to be happening compared to someone else's life, based off how, their struggles or lack of struggles were growing up.
That resonated with me so much too. I know that in my own personal experiences, just being a woman, that I have had a lot more open conversations with my friends and colleagues and just other women in general about pay and how much people make. And it just having that knowledge is so empowering. Even if someone has a completely different skill set from you, if they're your peer in any way, getting some perspective into in this very specific example, just how much someone is getting paid helps you kind of gauge what's going on in the world around you, right? So that's one example. And I think also the generational differences conversation, what you just said, Eve, reminds me of that too. I feel like we are in a time right now that is really into pitting generations against each other. I don't know who started it, but I think it's so misinformed and so unfortunate, because everyone has different, even if we're all peers, there's so much variety of opinion and perspective, just among people that are the same age. But when you're, talking about those generational differences, I don't know what it will take for people to look past the, like, my boss can't open a PDF kind of thing. Think like, this person has lived experience that I should openly and intentionally listen to and help inform my own perspective. So I don't know what that'll take.
It's funny. Oh, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, specific to student loans, this is a conversation that has come up for me multiple times with the generation above us, so like Gen X, or it's like, what do you mean you can't pay for college? Like, why can't you just have a job and also pay your tuition? And I think we mentioned in the episode, it's like, well, tuition doesn't cost $300 a year anymore, and depending on what school you go to, it can, at the end of college, you can, finish with $300,000 in debt, and that's not what it was like for the generations before us at all. So, how do we change that? I think there has to be like understanding. I'll admit, like, I've had conversations like that with, family or people in my life where I'm just like, are you serious? Like, that's just not how it works. But coming at it from an approach of, well, what was tuition when you went to school? It's like, well, let's look at the numbers, and like just kind of educating each perspective and understanding where the other person's coming from. I think it just takes that kind of dialogue, but sometimes it can be hard because there's just such a gap in lived experience sometimes that, like, it's easy to talk past each other and to be like us versus them.
Yeah, and you're wanting to give advice to someone or just kind of share your perspective, no matter how old you are. When you're in a conversation like that, your perspective and opinion is formed by your own experience. And so if tuition was $300 and you were able to pay it off, then that's your experience. But, if you're resistant to hearing what's going on now for younger generations, or they're resistant to hearing how things went for you, you kind of miss that opportunity to communicate and have a better understanding of where each other are coming from. And like you said, Eve, you like miss the opportunity to carry on knowledge to others by not talking about that.
Yeah, no, transparency has definitely become a modern day trend. And the point you made about it kind of being like the war between the generations. I mean, it goes back to just like the classic way of viewing, like age gaps, where it's, if you're talking to somebody who's 2 decades older than you, oftentimes there's some kind of like, okay, this person is more wise than me, has gone through more than me, is more experienced. And sometimes their viewpoint is, I'm more experienced, I'm more wise, I should be the one giving you advice. If I went through my college days and made it through, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to get through your college days and make it through. And it's like, okay, well, you're trying to compare, like you guys talked about before, it's like you're trying to compare those situations versus, ours currently. Someone above me who's, nearing retirement can't tell me, like, I worked a part-time job at a library and was able to find myself through school. Like, I know friends who've worked 3 jobs through undergrad and are still in debt. Like, it's not, you can't claim that that's sustainable anymore, because the average cost of everything has gone up significantly, while the average wage definitely hasn't. So, I know friends that have graduated getting salaries in like the 50, 60,000s while owing 6 figures in debt. And I know people that graduated with that same salary, but they were able to get through college without having to take a single dollar out on a loan, and now they're just saving. So, everyone's situation is different, and that needs to be a perspective that's understood by everyone.
Well, you said transparency. I want to shift the conversation to that, right? And the question about transparency from the donor perspective came up, where, donors, number one, like that generational gap or lived experience was so different that they didn't understand like the legitimacy of this cause, or like, why is this a need? And like the perception may have been like, I'm not giving a handout. Whereas like the real need is much deeper than that, which I think comes back to their mission, which, for the Prosperity Project, again, like connecting it to it being like a startup, Bree said, well, our MVP approach, like taking our small step, was to focus on eliminating student loan debt for Black women. But their bigger vision is creating that financial self-sufficiency and literacy, which, when we think about the nonprofit ecosystem, it's the holistic approach of how do we provide services that meet the immediate need, but then how do we also provide the support to help people fish and take care of themselves. But coming back to the transparency question, I thought it was really interesting how Bree was saying, well, donors are like really, these big donors particularly are saying like, well, I'm looking at my donation as an investment and what is the ROI of what I'm doing? And, what do you mean? Like, where'd you get these goodie bags? Like, is that what my money is going towards? And so, I think like the donor education piece around connecting dollars to impact, the whole premise of what we're doing, what we're starting with at MatchNice is coming up from Bree's lived experience as a nonprofit founder was super interesting for me.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely resonated, and it was interesting and cool to hear about Bree and her co-founder's journey to how they landed on what they're working on now, the student debt erasure versus their bigger vision. And obviously we're going through the same thing at MatchNice. We started with this and we still have our mission of connecting the nonprofit ecosystem to maximize social impact. Whoa, that's huge. And we want to just get going and do it. And we can't because we have to start with, peeling back the layers and saying, okay, well, how do you start that? Okay, well, what do you have to do first? Well, what do you have to do before that? And just paring it down and down. And it's so hard to pare down your bigger vision and your dream to get something that actually you can work on and get out there. So that just really resonated with me. And yeah, that story about the goodie bags at the event, I mean, that just was like, that was awful. And it made me think about donor-centric fundraising, right? And kind of what the status quo is now with donor-centric fundraising. Just that, yeah, a lack of transparency and education on, the fact that, hey, all of the things you see here were donated, right? And we're throwing this event to attract you here, person with a large check to write, so that we can keep our fundraising going. And I think when it comes to that ROI question, that stuck out of my head too, as we're seeking funding right now, right? And we're talking to investors, but the question about what's the ROI for me, I was like, for a nonprofit, is the ROI impact? Is that what we're wanting to see? And yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. What does ROI mean when you're speaking as a donor to a nonprofit? I hope it means impact.
So I'd say it does mean impact, but there has to be some level of metric applied to it. Otherwise, people just don't see it as ROI. They see it as like, oh, we helped people, take it or leave it, right? Like they want something that proves that there's value coming from their donations. And going back to that example of the goodie bags, right? Like the idea of transparency is, okay, I think Bree said that those goodie bags were actually donated, right? It wasn't a cost to them. Were the donors aware of that? Probably not, which is why they made the assumption and then decided to reduce their donation by, I think it was like 80%, like 5,000 down to 1,000, which is crazy to think about, but also understandable when you see, okay, if I'm going to give you my money, is it being used towards this? Are you spending all the donation on, showing appreciation to the donors, or is the money actually being applied towards generating the ROI they're looking for? And like I said, like this is where the transparency comes in play. And it's 2 points. One is, where's the transparency when it comes to how the money's being used in the donor's eyes, right? Like you hold these events, these goodie bags come into play. Like, is it, I guess donors need to see and know that like, hey, not only are we showing your appreciation, but these goodie bags are actually donated to us. So the money you're giving to us isn't being used towards stuff like this. It's being used towards our actual initiative and our missions. On top of that, it kind of comes back to our goal as MatchNice, right? We're trying to push the normalization of transparency between the donors and the nonprofits. Because at the end of the day, the trust factor, and we've talked about this with numerous nonprofit experts in the past, is the trust factor is the most fragile piece of a nonprofit to donor relationship. And once that's broken, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. And if it is rebuilt, it's never fully there. So what are approaches or ways that we can take to ensure that nonprofits are not only given a platform and multiple methods of showing transparency of where the money is going, but the donors are given peace of mind and aren't put in a position where they have to think about, hey, should I potentially reduce my donation to you because maybe the ROI isn't there and it might be there somewhere else for me to put this money.
It's a big, that story and Bree's other story about cutting fat from the budget for prosperity is keeping your eye on the mission, right? And like, what is the mission? And I think that if you're able to really be clear about that, and like you said, Priya, really be specific about that, it helps kind of inform the way that you speak about at an event like that, right? You're going to speak more clearly about where money is going, or when you're looking at the budget, you're going to go, what do we actually need here? And what is the MVP kind of, what are the MVP line items? And I know I'm probably misusing MVP there, but what are the bare bones things that we need to achieve our mission? And everything else can kind of be put off to the side. And you know, just as startup founders ourselves, we've had to do that as well. A lot of things that we thought, you know, initially that were essential in our budget, we will take another look and be like, not really. If our goal is to do XYZ, we don't need any of that right now. And that's just being clear about what your goals are and what impact you want to have.
Yeah, and on the equation of ROI, we had, you know, I love the answer she gave to my question about how they're looking at impact measurement above and beyond just the dollars that went towards eliminating student debt, which is for them a really great measure of the impact of like their purpose and what they're working on. The thing that really resonated the most with me is tying back to what Dr. Laura Otten said on our episode, and the question she asked about, is it ethical for nonprofits to continue doing what they're doing if they're not measuring what they're doing to learn and improve? And Bree's answer was just on the money, right? She said that, you know, well, you know, we're taking this approach of like measuring and testing things, and we're learning from what we're doing, and we're taking those learnings to improve the program. And like that is one of the biggest, like, not just like methods, but like attitudes and mindsets that I think is going to make the Prosperity Project just continue to be a great success for them, is this approach in terms of measurement and improvement.
That's something we've talked about a lot, and as a founding team, and also just in our conversations with nonprofit leaders or anyone that cares about social impact, which is that the learning and the longevity of how long it takes to, you know, move the needle on progress is a huge part of the equation that I think just gets overlooked a lot of times. And being able to measure what you're doing, see if it's working, look back, change the way that you're approaching things, and just keep trying to move things in the right direction takes a long time. And it takes a lot of effort to do that reflection and work, but it's so important. And I love that question that you asked her about what are, you know, especially in her case, because for Prosperity Project, that number of decreasing student debt for Black women is actually, it's not really bean counting. That is a direct metric measure of success. But I love that your question dug deeper about what are the other measures of success, because you're looking at that larger vision of, you know, of the Prosperity Project, right? Of financial literacy over time, and you know, helping women be self-sustainable or self-sufficient with their money. I think that was just such an important question, and it actually sparked some ideas for me about Match Nice, about the way that we talk about impact. Right now, we've talked about this in past episodes. We really try to focus on the storytelling, the intangibles, you know, those other measures of success. And I think there's probably, you know, this will be a conversation we all have later. But, you know, what are some other ways that we can incorporate that into our platform to help educate donors and take them on that journey of learning along with our nonprofits?
You know, the other thing about just transparency, which I think was radical transparency from Bree, that maybe we don't hear as often in the nonprofit sector, but we do sometimes in the for-profit, is the notion that some donor populations just may not be right. Like that you're just not the right fit. Like you're just not the type of person we're working on. And the process that Bree described of really becoming familiar with and understanding their target donors and who it is exactly that is going to vibe with their mission and understand what they're doing. I mean, we've had the same experience with our fundraising, right? Like it's investors who not only care about impact, but also have some lived experience in the nonprofit sector that totally get what we're doing. Like our pitch isn't even a pitch. It just goes right into a conversation about what we're doing. And we're not spending all this energy trying to convince this investor about why we're valuable and why the approach that we're taking is differentiated and like why we're going to make a huge difference in the world of nonprofit fundraising, because it's understood. Like those people get it. And it's the same principle for donors and nonprofits. Knowing your donor population will save you so much energy and sweat equity when it comes to fundraising.
Yeah, and you guys were talking a lot about an abundance mindset, and I know that it was kind of sprinkled throughout the conversation, talking about an abundance mindset, but we've certainly talked about that as well at Match Nice, of just what you said, that there might be a lot of no's at certain pockets when you're talking to investors or you're trying to talk to donors, but once you find those people are out there, the people that match with what you're trying to do are out there, and this has happened to me in the past. When you find a certain topic or you delve into something you're interested in, or you find that donor that's, that has all the parts that you want, there's more of that. There's always more of that. There's, you can dive in so deep and find an abundance of that, whatever it is, in any respect. So I just love that that's the way that she's thinking. And, she also talked about it when they kind of landed on the student loan erasure, right? So the fact that felt like a small topic in the umbrella of what they're trying to do overall with their larger vision. But then when you actually zoom in on that small topic, it is also huge. So I think that's just a good outlook to have.
Well, I had a couple other topics come up. I'm curious to see what else came up for you both. Another theme that came up in this interview was services, right? Like nonprofits providing specific services that generate revenue, that create a independence from just looking at donations, right? And for Bree, that was getting into the public speaking space. And, I just think it's a great creative example of really pretty much every nonprofit leader has the same opportunity. Like you're the expert on the ground doing the work that you're doing. There's a large community of people trying to affect social change around you. There's universities, there's so many different forums where people could just step up and just make revenue from sharing their passion, which is a really cool kind of aspect. And I think that's like hopefully one of the misconceptions about the nonprofit sector that we're breaking with this podcast and with the episode that we did with Tiffany and so many others, where we're showing that there are nonprofits that have business models where they're generating revenue, and that revenue is going back to support and make an impact in their communities. What other things came up for you guys? Anything else?
I was just going to say that what a amazing impact focused revenue stream for the Prosperity Project with speaking to high school students, because at the end of the day, if you're really focused on your mission, educating people who have not yet gone to college about the situation that you are trying to relieve people from, to hopefully help them not get into that same situation, when you think about it, could potentially put your own nonprofit out of business, right? If you don't have any more people, I mean, there's an abundance, like I just said, but if you don't have any more people to serve, that's actually good. That's actually good if your nonprofit's services are no longer needed, but it's a weird way to think about it. So what it just is such a great example of really being focused on the mission, and choosing where to do her speaking. Just really awesome.
No, I agree. Like tackling that problem from the source, to say, like the way to put it is a very smart approach to take, especially when trying to remediate this from happening to a majority of the population going forward. And a point you made, Pui, about we've had this conversation a few times before, especially with a few of the people we've talked to in this industry, is nonprofits definitely can't be dependent on donations in the long term, just because it's not sustainable, right? You can't be waiting for that check to come in to pay rent or to pay a wage for an employee of the nonprofit. Coming up with these revenue streams, whether it be consistent or intermittent, it doesn't matter. It's a way to form some level of independence from the donor base, because at the end of the day, being in a position where your mission can only be driven by donor funds is a very bad position to be in, especially when that's basically giving them the power to dictate, like, this is how much money you have going forward. Like, no, if you're a nonprofit and there are ways that you can take advantage of creating these revenue streams, whether it be providing those services that we talked about or just providing something that generates some sort of revenue. So one example was like the public speaking that Bree does. The other is just providing services to potentially other nonprofits that work in similar industries. Maybe you're a more vetted nonprofit in the area and there's a bunch of newer ones that are starting out in different areas nearby. Why can't you be a form of consulting service or just a point of reference for them, build a relationship, and then that could potentially formulate some kind of, revenue stream for you going forward as somebody who's not only trying to survive as a nonprofit, but also trying to assist these other newer nonprofits in surviving the beginning journey, which is probably the hardest part to get through.
Yeah, I agree, Eve. It's the diversification of funding sources that's so important for nonprofits to have. And, our part of our vision for Match Nice, right, was to help nonprofits democratize fundraising with donors so that they're not just dependent on these one or two big, check writers or the one or two grants that they might be applying for. And, in terms of like the tough phases of nonprofits, like what was really interesting to hear, and this is, I think, definitely the case for the majority of nonprofits. I think like 90% of all nonprofits have budgets of less than $1 million or considered grassroots. And for those nonprofits, the fact that like just 30% of all of donations like come at the last month of the year, and the summer, this period that we're in right now, like represents this dry season of funding, just made me realize that nonprofit, like at least these grassroots nonprofits, are kind of like in the situation that NFL players are in, where like NFL players may get that like one really big check up front or like once or twice a year. And then they're forced to ration that out and be super mindful with how they spend, and, not having that consistent source of revenue or funding, in many ways can what is that, not bootstrap, hamstring a nonprofit from really being the most impactful that they can.
Yeah, it really was heartbreaking to hear Bree talk about how the people that she has to send the sorry to inform you messages to are her prosperettes, right? Like the people who she's serving are the people who are being hurt by them being in this kind of like hamstrung situation. So yeah, I'd love to hear, maybe we can do like a blog post on this or something, but I'd love to hear some more like creative additional revenue stream ideas from other nonprofits out there. What have you done to bring in additional revenue to help kind of keep an income stream coming in when you are going through these dry spells with donations? Yeah, I'd just be really interested to hear. I think that could become a really good resource to share with our peeps.
To keep this episode from being like 3 hours long, we should probably look to wrap up our debrief. I'll just end on the point of, the last question I asked Bree, which was like, what is it that you as a Black woman in the nonprofit sector would want now or need the most? And her answer just really connected with my heart when she said, it's just the belief. Like, I just want people to believe in me, to just have people have the faith and belief in this next generation of nonprofit leaders. And I connected with it and I'm sure the same way that Ibrahim, you and Madeline also connected with it as a startup founder, where it can be very lonely, and it's like that belief factor of having your friends and family being like, what is it that you're doing? How are you going to make money? Like all those questions that we face, having that energy and the support is so important. And I just want to give a huge shout out to Bree and all the other people out there starting nonprofits, all the people who have started or thinking about starting, to not be dissuaded by the challenges of the journey. It can be very fulfilling, and if you believe in yourself, you can make it happen.
We believe in you.
We believe in
We
you.
believe in you. I think that was also such an important message. Wow, it's so simple, but it's harder to come by than you would think sometimes. And sometimes I do think that just by saying it, right? Just by putting yourself out on a limb and saying, I need support. I need people to support me. You'll be surprised how many people kind of come out of the woodwork and say, oh my gosh, well, I never said it, but like, of course I support you and let's talk about it, because it can certainly feel like the other way around sometimes.
Don't be afraid to ask for help, and don't be afraid to believe in yourself. Madeline, Ibrahim, thanks for joining this great debrief. We'll catch you on the next episode.
Thanks for having us, Briana.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope you learned something new from our conversation with Bree. We always learn so many new things and come away with so many new questions from conversations just like this. And I want to end with a quote like I usually do. And I realize I'm reading this quote as a man, but hey, here we go. Serena Williams said, "Every woman's success should be an inspiration to another. We're strongest when we cheer each other on." And I want to shine the light on Briana Franklin, Bree Franklin, and everything she's doing with the Prosperity Project to inspire others, Black girls and women all around, to be financially empowered and to deal with what can be a very crippling experience with student loan debt. Check out their nonprofit, the Prosperity Project. Grateful to have you join on another episode of the Nonprofit Lab. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe and whatever other bells and whistles to let you know when we release new episodes. Thanks for tuning in, and be well.